Welcome everyone to Current in 30, the 30-minute webinar series brought to you by the Current Consulting Group. We are thrilled to have you with us. To briefly introduce this series, each session is designed to keep you informed, efficient, and ahead of the curve. On the second and fourth Mondays of each month throughout 2026, we'll break down key things you need to know about workplace drug screening, from emerging trends and regulatory updates to best practices and practical implementation tips. If you missed our previous sessions, please visit our website, currentconsultinggroup.com, or our YouTube channel at Current Consulting Group to view those sessions. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Greta Walsh of the Current Consulting Group, and today's presentation is titled Marijuana in the Workplace: What Employers Need to Know About Impairment, Testing, and State Laws. This presentation qualifies for half of a professional development credit from Sherman HRCI for those who attend today's presentation in its entirety. Today's presentation welcomes Senior Legal Consultant of the Current Consulting Group, Yvette Farnsworth-Baker. Yvette is a director for all law-related services, including Current Consulting Group's extensive compliance services. Yvette is a licensed attorney and member of the Florida Bar. As an expert in drug and alcohol testing case law, Yvette regularly consults on issues involving state law and federal regulations, in addition to authoring articles for industry publications. She also helps produce content for Current Compliance, the most comprehensive and up-to-date online database of state drug testing laws, including marijuana and workers' compensation laws. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Yvette Farnsworth-Baker from the Current Consulting Group.
Thank you so much, Greta, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm really happy to be doing this presentation for you on a really important subject, which is marijuana and the workplace. So let me just briefly go over our agenda for today. We're going to start out talking about current trends in marijuana use in the workplace. So we're going to discuss people using marijuana while commuting to work and during work hours and look at some pretty shocking statistics on that. We're going to talk about federal regulations, state laws, local ordinances, who has authority to regulate workplace drug testing and marijuana drug testing in particular. We're going to talk about what employers should look for in state marijuana laws, how to monitor legislative changes. It's really issue spotting so that you know what to look for and what can affect workplace drug testing in various laws. And we're going to close by talking about what to include about marijuana in a company's drug testing policy. So all important information for people in this field. So as I said, we'll start out talking about current trends in marijuana use during work hours and while commuting to work. Let's start out with a nationwide survey by the National Safety Council. National Safety Council's survey found that over half of respondents saying that impairment is decreasing the safety of their workplace. And these are employers saying, over half of employers saying impairment is decreasing the safety of their workforce. We have 43% saying impairment has increased workers' comp claims, 45% saying impairment is causing more misses, 39% saying impairment is causing more injuries. That's an important one. And 36% of respondents saying impairment is a problem in their workforces. Now, this survey is not specific to marijuana impairment, but impairment in general, which can be impairment by other drugs, alcohol, or impairment by things like tiredness or distraction. So this is just talking about impairment in general, but it does tell us that over half of employers say that impairment is decreasing the safety of their workforce. And when we talk about marijuana use in this day and age, we really are focused on safety and impairment in the workplace. So here are some statistics in a survey of employees. So the NSC statistics was a survey of employers. Now this is a survey of employees. And in a survey of 500 employees who were marijuana users, 31% said that they used marijuana during their commute to the workplace. 77% of marijuana users in this survey said that they use marijuana at home before leaving for work. And 48%, that's almost half of marijuana users, admit that they use marijuana at work, either during breaks or while actively working. To me, I've seen these statistics many times, worked with them many times, and every time I'm still very shocked by it. That over half, or not over half, but just under half of marijuana users say that they use marijuana at work. We have another survey here of over 1,000 admitted illicit drug users. Now, this is not just marijuana, this is any kind of illicit drug, and 28% admit to getting high on the way to work. And in our last statistic down here, this is a current consulting group survey. In our 2024 drug testing industry survey, 59% of respondents said that they believe the decision to discontinue testing for marijuana encourages employees to consume marijuana before work. So this study, this survey by current consulting group, this is not just marijuana users or illicit drug users. This is a survey of all individuals. Almost 60% said that when employers discontinue testing for marijuana, it encourages people to use marijuana before coming to work. So these are important statistics just to set us up to understand why is it important that we talk about marijuana testing. Let's talk a little bit more about employees using marijuana while on the job. A survey of employees, and now again, this is not just marijuana using employees, this is not just illicit drug using employees, this is a survey of all employees, said 1 in 5 say that they have used marijuana specifically, recreationally in the workplace during work hours. So 1 in 5 employees in general using recreational marijuana in the workplace. Again, this is a very shocking statistic to me, but it just emphasizes how important it is that we talk about marijuana and marijuana testing. 500 marijuana using employees, 48% admitted using marijuana at work. We talked about that statistic before. 1,000 admitted illicit drug users who are admitting that they are getting high on their lunch break. They are getting high in the afternoon while at work. They're getting high in the morning while at work. They're getting high on their way home. I mean, on the way home is not so important to us, but that's only 5%. 22.8% saying they're getting high on their lunch break, and that is very important for the workplace. So let's talk about marijuana impairment. I feel like the science knows a lot about alcohol impairment, and in our own daily lives, our own experiences, we know a lot about how alcohol impairs people, and we know less about how marijuana impairment lasts, how marijuana impairment impacts people. So here's a little information. We have a 2021 analysis of 80 scientific studies from around the world. So this is not just one survey, one study. This is an analysis of 80 different scientific studies. And it concludes that cannabis impairment lasts between 3 and 10 hours. The reason that we have such a range is it depends on the dosages of THC that are being consumed, how the cannabis is being consumed. There can be a range, but the average is about impairment. The smallest amount of impairment lasts at least 3 hours, and then it goes up to about 10 hours in general. 10 hours, the scientific studies are telling us if THC is being consumed orally, in a gummy, in an edible, and if it's a high dose of THC, that's when impairment can last, closer to 10 hours. A typical duration is more like 4 hours when THC is being smoked or vaped, and simpler tasks are being undertaken. Impairment is considered higher when someone's doing a complex task. Driving is considered a complex task, just for a little understanding of what that means. A complex task like driving, you're going to be impaired longer than 3 to 4 hours in general. So what this means is employees who are getting high on the way to work, just before they go to work, on their lunch break, are very likely impaired while they are working. Unless someone is commuting in like 4 or 5 hours, if they are using marijuana before they come to the workplace, they are going to be working while impaired. And complex tasks like driving, operating heavy machinery, safety sensitive tasks, um, the results can be very negative for employees who are working while impaired by marijuana. Marijuana impaired workers are unsafe in the workplace. I mean, hopefully this is common sense, but we have a lot of information from Quest Diagnostics about that. Quest is telling us in 2023, marijuana post-accident positive drug tests for marijuana reached a 25-year high. Now, these are, again, I want to emphasize post-accident drug tests. So an accident has happened. Someone is immediately drug tested and they test positive for marijuana. Those positive tests were at a 25-year high in 2023. So it's very alarming and very serious. So let's talk about the laws around testing for marijuana in the workplace, testing employees, testing applicants. We need to think about federal regulations. We need to think about state laws. We need to think about local ordinances. So I'm just going to give you a brief run through of these so that you know how to issue spot, you know where to look, you know what you need to be educated on when we talk about the laws surrounding marijuana drug testing. So I'm just going to go over this chart really briefly. This has to do with state laws. There are a lot of state laws that can impact workplace drug testing. The most important, here at the top, you see mandatory/voluntary. Mandatory laws are going to be the most important. What I call mandatory laws are state laws that say if you are drug testing employees or applicants, they have to be drug tested in this way within this state. So those apply to every employer who's drug testing within that state, unless it's preempted by federal regulation. And it applies to marijuana testing as well as testing for other drugs and alcohol and other substances. Mandatory laws have to be complied with. Now, not every state has a mandatory law. Here at the top, we see it's about 17 states that have mandatory drug testing laws, about 4 cities and 1 territory. But if you're within those states, territories, or cities, you need to be following the mandatory law. Now, down here at the bottom, medical and recreational marijuana laws. The marijuana laws that are passed these days very, very often impact the way you can test for marijuana in the workplace. When marijuana laws were new and were first being passed, they did not usually impact the way you can test for marijuana. But now, more often than not, they do contain some kind of clause or provision that impacts employers and how marijuana is dealt with in the workplace. So those are really important to know about. Case law talks about court decisions that come down. There are some of those that need to be that you need to be aware of. Workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, and voluntary laws. Those are not mandatory if you want to receive the benefits of those laws. For example, if you want to deny workers' comp payments for an employee who tests positive post-accident, you need to test in accordance with the workers' comp laws. Like, you have to follow the way they lay out drug testing. But if you drug test in another way, you're not breaking the law. You're just going to miss out on some benefits. So those are less important. Industry-specific laws, those are important within those industries, but it's a small number of industries. Usually it's things like public works projects, mining. Occasionally it's like childcare or bus drivers who have to be tested in a specific way. But most employers won't be impacted by industry-specific laws. So how do state laws and federal regulations work together? There are federal regulations that regulate drug testing, but only for very specific employers, and those employers are going to know who they are. Mostly it's Department of Transportation. employers who have to follow federal regulations. But all employers also need to be aware of state laws. Even if an employer is regulated by the federal government, more than likely you're going to have some employees who are not regulated. You have office staff, you have other employees who are not drivers or in those roles. And so any employee who's not regulated by the federal government, the drug testing of those employees or those applicants needs to follow state law. And also any employer who's not federally regulated, who's not impacted by Department of Transportation regulations or the like, have to follow state law. So many state drug testing laws mirror the federal regulations. Many of them say you have to test just like federal government tests. So it's an interesting interplay there. But employers who are regulated are going to know that they're regulated. Everyone else really needs to be following state law. Now, all state and federal regulations allow an employer to prohibit employers working while impaired by marijuana. All state and federal regulations allow an employer to prohibit employees possessing marijuana in the workplace or using marijuana in the workplace. So this needs to be the bare minimum of any workplace policy. So let's talk about what employers need to look for in state marijuana laws in order to know how they're impacted in their workplace by marijuana laws. Now, testing for marijuana is legal in all 50 states. I very often will have an employer say to me, oh, I can't test for marijuana in my state. I'm not allowed to. And that is never true. All states allow an employer to test for marijuana. The state laws, though, may impact who you test, how you test, and most often it's going to impact what you do with a positive result. Most marijuana laws that impact workplace testing don't say you can't test for marijuana. They say if someone tests positive for marijuana, this is how you have to handle it. So that is usually where you need to focus your attention, less so on can I test for marijuana? Yeah, you can test for marijuana. Let's just look at who and how and what you do with the results. So I'm going to go over some of these broad categories of state marijuana laws and just give you an idea of how these impact the workplace. And then you can know, okay, let me look at these specific states and see which category of law they fall into, and then you'll have a good idea of how to handle that in the workplace. So we have about 21 states that have legal medical marijuana, but do not require an employer to do any accommodations for medical marijuana use. So what I mean by that is, for example, in Alabama, Alabama does have legal medical marijuana. However, Alabama allows an employer to test for marijuana, allows an employer to discipline an employee for a positive test, allows an employer to fire an employee for a positive marijuana test, allows an employer to refuse to hire an applicant for testing positive, even if this is medical marijuana use in accordance with state law. So these are the easiest states to operate in for an employer because the employer can treat medical marijuana use like any other drug use if they so choose. So our next category are states that have medical marijuana, have legal medical marijuana, but they do require some kind of accommodation. This is about another 21 states and also DC and some city ordinances. So let's use the example of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has legal medical marijuana. An employer can test employees within Pennsylvania for marijuana. However, if someone tests positive and they have a valid state medical marijuana card or certification or license, an employer can't fire that employee solely for their positive test when it's valid medical marijuana use. That doesn't mean the employee can't be disciplined at all for anything related to marijuana, but a positive test on its own, if they have a legal card, you can't fire them or discipline them or discriminate them solely based on that positive tests. So what can you do? In Pennsylvania and in these other 21 states plus, if an employee is showing signs of being impaired by marijuana in the workplace, or if you have some evidence that they use marijuana in the workplace or during work hours, or they possess marijuana in the workplace, that coupled with a positive test, you can fire someone, discipline someone, discriminate someone based on that. It's not just the positive test, but it's the positive test plus another factor, plus signs of being impaired by working is like the best one, is the easiest one and the most common one. If you have signs that someone is impaired or evidence that they're impaired in the workplace plus a positive test, then you can impose discipline. So there's just, an extra step involved, an extra amount of information or evidence involved before disciplining an employee. The positive test alone is not enough. And again, this is just medical marijuana, so they do need to have a valid card or certification to receive these accommodations. We do have some states, about 10 states plus DC, that require some accommodations for recreational marijuana. So, for example, Illinois. In Illinois, if someone uses marijuana off of work premises during non-working hours and they test positive for marijuana based on that, they can't be disciplined or terminated from employment or, not hired for a job because of that kind of marijuana use. Again, if they are impaired in the workplace, if they are using marijuana in the workplace, if they are possessing marijuana in the workplace, you can discipline, terminate employment based on a positive drug test plus impairment in the workplace, plus possessing marijuana in the workplace, but not based on a positive test alone. So you need some extra information in these 10 states plus DC, and this is for recreational use. It's not a large number of states, but it is growing. It is something anytime a recreational marijuana law is passed, we're looking for this information. Do we need to make accommodations for recreational use? Because those numbers are growing, and that's something we're always looking for. We have some atypical state laws. We have California and Washington. California and Washington prefer employers to use tests that do not detect marijuana metabolites, but are detecting the active THC in marijuana. What that means practically is California and Washington prefer an oral fluid test, which is a saliva drug test, over a urine test or a hair test, because urine and hair testing is just detecting metabolites. It's not urine and hair are not recent use detection methods. Before marijuana metabolites turn up in your urine or your hair, quite a bit of time has to pass. And those metabolites continue to show up in your urine and hair for a long time past marijuana use. Oral fluid is a recent use detection method, meaning marijuana is showing up in your saliva within minutes of marijuana use, and then it is not showing up in your saliva after a certain number of hours of use, maybe a day, but it's looking for more recent use and not historical use. So California and Washington prefer employers to use oral fluid testing over urine testing or hair testing. New York prohibits most marijuana testing. There's just a small number of circumstances in New York in which you can test for marijuana. This is the closest we get to a complete ban on marijuana testing, but New York, you still can test for marijuana in some circumstances. It's just not very many. Minnesota prohibits pre-employment testing for marijuana. It also prohibits random testing for marijuana. So Minnesota is just like a little atypical in that way. So federal law, state law, Department of Transportation, The laws are changing in favor of oral fluid testing. Like I just mentioned, California and Washington prefer oral fluid testing to urine testing because it's detecting active THC and not metabolite. Um, we are seeing trends like this in a lot of ways where laws are trending in favor of oral fluid testing and in favor of recent use detection as opposed to tests like hair and urine that are detecting historical use. So this is very interesting to follow. The federal government, the federal regulations have been passed like several years ago to permit oral fluid testing. That was such a huge deal. It takes the federal government such a long time to pass changes and to like kind of get up to date with newer technologies. So it took a long time to get there with oral fluid, but those laws have been passed. Again, this just shows us that everything is trending in favor of oral fluid testing. And it also shows us that oral fluid testing really is now like tried and tested and a very good standard, a very like widely used method of drug testing now. So if you're not up to date on oral fluid testing, it really is something to educate yourself on. So our last section here, we're going to talk about what to include about marijuana in a company's drug testing policy. So you need to set up the right program. You need to be familiar with all applicable marijuana laws. If you don't feel up to, really being educated on all these individual laws, you really need to work with an expert who is, because gone are the days where one size fits all, where, one standard for marijuana use will work in, all the different states. Really, now you need a policy that is going to be specific to the states in which this employer operates, because the state laws can vary so widely. We look at New York that restricts so like almost all marijuana testing, and then we look at, say, Florida, which permits like pretty much all marijuana testing. You don't want the same policy for those two states. It doesn't make sense, and it's not going to likely be compliant. So drug testing policies need to be in compliance with every state in which employees are working. The best defense against these restrictive marijuana laws is to follow them to the letter. It's really not impossible to write policies that comply with even these very restrictive state laws. Drug testing policies can include marijuana in all of the various states. You just need to do it the right way. So again, we talked about oral fluid being endorsed by the federal government now. We would say the gold standard of a drug testing policy, whether you're regulated or unregulated, is going to be a method that's endorsed by the federal government. Right now, it's lab-based urine testing or lab-based oral fluid testing. At some point, hair testing is going to be included in that. That's just not quite set up yet. We have talked a little bit about how oral fluid testing is recent use. I mean, one of the great things about oral fluid testing, especially as we're talking about people using marijuana on their way to work, just before they leave work, on their lunch break, is oral fluid is capturing marijuana in the saliva within minutes of use. There's almost no delay there between someone using marijuana and it showing up in their oral fluid. So that's really important to think about when you're thinking about a safe workplace where someone might be using marijuana or any illicit drug on their lunch break and then going to work, 30 minutes later. So that you need to keep that in mind when thinking of the right drug testing method. So, this webinar is focused on marijuana, but when we're talking about setting up a drug testing program, you really need to be looking for all common drugs of abuse. If you're using, a third-party administrator or an outside company to do your drug testing, talk with them and say, what drugs are we covering and what drugs do I need to be covering? What are the drugs of abuse in my community what are the scariest drugs of abuse, and is my testing program covering those drugs? Obviously, we're focused on marijuana in this webinar, but that's not the only drug that impacts the safety of a workplace. So cover all common drugs of abuse, use confirmation testing, especially confirmation testing in a laboratory. It might make sense for you to be doing on-site testing and instant testing to get quick results and to, not have to send people out, but make sure you're doing confirmation testing of positive. Use the expertise of a medical review officer who can verify positive results and who can eliminate, legal drugs, prescription drugs, anything like that. And if you can follow federal guidelines, that's really the gold standard. Ultimately, what you're trying to do in a workplace policy is keep your workplace safe. You're not trying to discriminate against anyone's life choices, but you want to make sure that the workplace is safe for all employees. Not trying to discriminate against people based on their own choices, but making sure that they are treated like anyone else. And if someone is impaired by anything, that they're being taken off safety sensitive work sites, that they're being taken off driving tasks when they're impaired. So we just want everyone to be showing up to work fit for duty, using common safe safety procedures, not being impaired while working, whether it be marijuana, another drug, or any other situation that's going to impair a person and make the workplace less safe. Employers' rights. Just because marijuana is legal does not mean that employers surrender their rights to a safe workplace. Like we've talked about, the laws can be a little complex or confusing, but employers have the right to keep their workplace safe. In all 50 states, regardless of the complexities of the laws, it is always the right move for an employer to prohibit employees from bringing marijuana to work, using marijuana at work, being under the influence or being impaired by marijuana at work. That should just be the baseline of any policy. And drug testing providers need to make sure that they're being aware of what the laws are and what they need to be putting in place so that employers have the safest workplace. Finally, respect the rights of employees, respect the laws and follow the laws, but ultimately prohibit employees from bringing marijuana in the workplace, using marijuana on the job, working while under the influence. Keep in mind applicants as well when we're talking about this, and follow the laws and keep your workplace as safe as possible. We're here to help. We are the experts in drug testing. So if any of this feels overwhelming or too confusing, you can always come to Current Consulting Group and we can help you with educating yourself on the laws, reading up on the latest trends and the latest laws that have been passed. We can help develop policies, write policies, do compliance services, online training, in-person training. We can do it all. So if any of this feels like just too much, we are here to help. That's what our job is. Greta, do we have any other words to close on?
Thank you, Yvette. Actually, we have some questions, but we'll have to answer them offline because we've reached our time limit here. But thank you again, Yvette, and thank you to everyone joining us for today's edition of Current in 30. We hope that today's insights helped you stay informed and confident in your workplace drug screening decisions. As a reminder, this presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions in a few days on how to access the recording. Additionally, this presentation qualified for half of a professional development credit from Sherman HRCI for those who attended today's presentation in its entirety. If you have met that requirement, you will be emailed those activity IDs. Remember, we'll be back every second and fourth Monday of 2026 with key things you need to know to stay current in this industry. Be sure to follow the Current Consulting Group and check your inbox for upcoming session details. Until next time, stay current and have a great day.